Hi, my name is Selena Valadez, and I'm joined by my guest, Susy Arredondo. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name is Susy. I'm 29 years old. I'm non binary. I majored in psychology and I like to read books.
Thank you for sharing. And today we are working as part of the Long Story Short project, which is part of the 2024-2025 UTEP EPCC Humanities Collaborative. And we will be discussing Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And so just a little bit of background before we get started. A Room of One's Own is a lecture that Virginia Woolf gave in 1928, and it was on the topic of women in fiction. And she she ended up turning this lecture into an essay, which is what we will be talking about. And that essay was published in 1929. So before we get started, or before we get too into it, I wanted to see, Susie, what you think. Like, what were your first thoughts when you read this?
Right. So my first time reading this essay, this book, was focused on feminism because it does mention a lot of women's issues. But after paying a little bit more attention to her words, to the way that she explains everything in the book, I figured out that it's a little bit more than that. And that makes it a lot more impactful because it's not just about female or women, it's about genders, about the impact it has on our society as in in a broader sense.
Yes, I completely agree, and I really like that you touched on, she's not just talking about women and men, right? That's one of the criticisms that often gets brought up, is that it's very binary. But I think if we really look closer, we can tell that she is really talking about all these things, right? She's talking about privilege. She's talking about a lack of education, a lack of access to language. She's talking about the way that we think about gender. She's talking about income inequality, opportunity inequality in terms of like careers. Women didn't have a lot of options. Sometimes they didn't have any options to work. So I think it can definitely be applied to a lot of marginalized groups. And it's not just women, right? Like people of color, um, your citizenship status. Like this can literally we can broaden this to a
Yes.
bunch of different groups. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I also wanted to ask you, what's something that you really liked, like when you first read it? What's something that stood out to you?
The way that it's told, the way that it is explained without being too direct, I think that it's what makes it as unique as it is.
Yeah, I agree, and kind of touching going off of that, what do you think about her choice to tell this in a nonfiction way, right? Like she's giving us a story and she's giving us a lot of symbolism. So what did you think about that when you read it?
So I think it is very creative in a sense because it gets to the reader as a story, but it includes a lot more than just fiction. It has facts about how life used to be for women, for writers, and for any other kind of minority that it could be mentioned or it could be applied to. But still getting the attention of the reader as if it was with fiction, using the metaphors and using all of these long explanations that end up being a kind of eureka moment when you realize what she's talking about.
I agree, and I also want to add that oftentimes when we look at when we're analyzing something, especially a text, people tend to criticize something when it feels too preachy. And I think one of the great things that she does in A Room of One's Own is that she's not trying to shove this idea down our throats, right? She's sort of giving us a story, and she's kind of sprinkling in. She talks about that nugget, right? Like when she's giving a lecture, when anybody's giving a lecture, you're expected to leave the students with that nugget, like that thing that they can take with them. And I think for her, She does a really great job of like sprinkling those things in, right? And like she doesn't just talk about again one thing. She goes into, she has like this hyper awareness, not just of like her position as a woman at that time, but also like her privilege, which I think is really important because, you know, we're getting this side of her, and this story is from a position of privilege, despite, you know, her having that, being oppressed as a woman. She still has some privilege that others don't, and that others still don't have today. Um, but I really appreciate that, excuse me, I really appreciate that she acknowledges that, and that she has a hyper awareness of like what it takes, right? Because she's not just talking about, she's not just saying like, oh, you need money and a room of your own, right? She's saying more than that. She's saying women or people, anybody who is experiencing disparities, that we need the freedom to create. We need a space, and we need access to language. Talks about how a lot of women, a lot of stories were written by men, and they were written by men about women, and I think that's something that we still see today. Um, Especially like, I'm a movie buff, so when I go to the movies, I always think about how many times I'm watching a movie about a woman, and the story is about a woman, or and that story is being told from the male perspective, right? And I think that really shifts the way that I interpret, or the way that I interact with that piece of media, because it's different when you see a story told by a woman about a woman, and especially when they have that lived experience. And so I want to know like, what was something else that you took away, that you maybe can relate to what I just said, or something else that you noticed.
Yeah, so for that specifically that you mentioned about the perspective, like in the movies, when you see a female character, but it is written by a man, it is very interesting how you said it, and it relates to the this idea that you share, that she is not trying to shove the information down the reader's throat. It's just trying to give them the information, the story, let's say, so that they can take away whatever they want from it. And I feel like that perspective of a female written by a man is still kind of the having the same idea, because once you see something from other person's perspective, you take a little bit of their perspective, um, in the way that they present it to you. So if they want you to have this information as a fact, you're going to start believing that information as a fact. But if they are just sprinkling some information and they are giving you this idea of, okay, this could be the way that women are, but maybe this other way could be as well, then you start to create your own criteria for what you believe in. But it does influence a lot on how we see stories, or how we see the main character, especially if it's female.
Yes, I agree, and I think it also, it really changes the way that we, like, for me, when I go and I see a movie about a woman written by a man, or from that perspective, it changes the way that you see yourself. And that's something that Virginia Woolf also talks about, how when we get stories that are written from one perspective, which is typically like the male perspective, um, we start to internalize those ideals, right? We internalize the ideals that they want us, or this idea that they have of us. And again, we can broaden that not to just female and male, right? We can, like, for example, in movies, right? The way that, I'm Mexican, the way that Mexicans are depicted in movies is not always realistic, right? And so I think like it's interesting that she talks about that, and that she talks about how, um, yeah, just how, like, if you're only getting this side of that story, then you're gonna have the wrong idea of,
Right.
of who these characters are, or who these people are, because you're only going off of that one perspective, and that perspective has all these ideals that they're either purposefully or subconsciously pushing, right? And so, let's see. So she also mentions, actually, going back to what we were saying about perspective, she talks about how it's important for, in this story, for women to have, not necessarily to write from like a place of anger. She talks a lot about that, and she talks about this idea of the of being androgynous, and of the womanly uh the womanly man or the manly woman, right? And how in Shakespeare's case, she says that he really does a good job of being able to sort of separate himself and kind of be able to look at both perspectives. And it almost seems like she's saying like this is like a more objective way of writing. What do you think about that?
I think it's interesting because when I first read the idea that she shares on androgyny, androgynous mind, I I completely agreed with it because it is true that sometimes we get too carried away by stereotypes of what a woman should be or what a man should be or what their professions are. But if we write like that, or even if we just read anything like that, we're going to be having this very closed idea of what the text is, or instead of writing something that we really believe in, we're just going to be basing ourselves in these stereotypes of a woman or a man instead of just being separated from both and writing something out of what it really is, what we really believe it is.
Right, and I think there's also something in there that she's saying about authenticity, and how, if we think of everything in this, like, for example, if women were to write about stories from a place of anger, then it's kind of like blocking you off from being able to look at everything in a more empathetic way, or in a more objective way. And I think that's important because I think for myself, sometimes I do find myself too, like, being so like caught up in all the ways that women don't have equality, or whatever your group that you identify with. Like, I get caught up in that, and I think sometimes it does kind of like keep you from seeing um, everything in a more holistic way. And I really like that she says that. And so I also want to talk about. She also mentions how um, how women, how one day she has this vision that women will have all the access to all the things that men do. She even says that they'll be able to have the same jobs, they'll be able to do the same things. Um, and I think in some ways that vision came true, and in some ways it didn't. And I was wondering, like, what do you think about that?
Technically, women do have the same opportunities to follow a specific job career, but it is still uh, being kind of not completely there. As you know, we have a lot of disparities in the pay that women receive versus the pay that they are supposed to receive if this was equal to both genders. Um, but overall, it's interesting how it has developed to be like, yes, women have more opportunities, but at the same time they are being seen only as women opportunities, and the men are just slowly going away from those. I don't know if that makes sense
Yeah.
in a sense.
Yeah, and I think to go off of a little bit what you said, I think also when we talk about, there are, like you said, there's still in a page gaps, pay, sorry, wage gaps, right, in the pay. um and I think there's also been, at least that I've noticed, is that there's been a pushback anytime that there's progress in whichever area, for whatever demographic, there's always pushback. And I've at least felt that, yes, we have more stories written by women and people of color and non-binary people, and like all these different demographics, than she did back then. Either the fact that we're even talking about what we're talking about, we're pushing the needle forward. But I think there's also a lot of pushback, right? Like that comes from that. Yes, we still have access, like you said, in the sense like we have opportunity to do certain jobs, but even when you look at those opportunities, like they still tend to be very male dominated. And then when there is a woman, or anybody who doesn't, who kind of like threatens that, I feel like there's the environment is very hostile, and sometimes whether they explicitly push that person out or not, they get pushed out because of all that hostility, right? Um, and I also like that Virginia Woolf talks about the way that we internalize, um, especially in a patriarchal society, the way that we internalize misogyny, right? And how sometimes women, especially at that time, maybe they were hearing all these things that men were saying, and they thought, oh, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't write anything. Maybe who cares? Maybe nobody cares what I'm gonna write. Um, and I was wondering, like, what do you think about that?
So I think you're right. Um, it is it is a bit unfair that we have um, that internalized misogyny about this topic specifically, because for me, writing has always felt like the way that you can let yourself and your feelings be expressed freely. Um, but it is true that there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of um, things that women did not well, felt that they were not able to do at the moment, and still now it is still kind of not completely there, as in feeling the freedom to do something as writing. But I was actually, not long ago, I read something or saw somewhere, I don't remember exactly, but I saw that since women are beginning to, or rising, the writing of women, it's been mostly prevalent. Um, they predicted that writing and fiction writing in itself was going to be mostly a women's activity, a women position or field, and it was going to be seen as a little bit less than, only because women were doing it a lot more than men.
Right. And I like that you bring that up because actually, Virginia Woolf also talks about um, that. She let me see if I wrote it down here. Okay, so she says there's a quote that I wrote that actually deals with that, and she says this is an important book, the critics assume, because it deals with war. This is an insignificant book because it deals with the feelings of women in a drawing room. So I think there's this way that we dictate importance, right, based on who's writing it and what the stories are. So we sometimes we think like romance novels, or oh, that's not serious writing, or that's not important. But all these stories are important, and it doesn't have to be something necessarily huge or traumatic like a war for it to be important, for it to matter. Because I think now we're moving towards the idea that yes, emotions, we're starting to express our emotions more, and we're starting to um, place importance on that, as opposed to like back then when we really didn't. So that's interesting that you say that, about what you read. I think that's an interesting point. And I also want to talk about um, why do you think authenticity is essential in literature, and how can writers stay true to what they write? Because Virginia Woolf talks a lot about authenticity, not just in this book, but I think throughout her life she's talked about it. So, what do you think about that?
I think it is important because we have so many stories written about this same or very similar theme, but with authenticity, we are able to distinguish each one, and we read something different even if it's about the same theme. So I think it is important for an author or just anybody who wants to write, to be authentic and to find their own voice, just as Virginia Woolf does. It's very easy to address a topic that they give you, but it's up to each different and unique person to address it in their own way. And that's what makes someone authentic, I believe.
And I agree. I think it's really important, and I think, um, especially, for people that want to get published, I always hear people that write books, they go through an editing process, and then, you have an editor telling you, maybe you should take that out, maybe you don't want to write about this. Or sometimes we self-edit too. Like, I think sometimes we do that to ourselves when we're writing. We tend to, maybe think about, okay, how are people going to perceive this? Um, does this make me look bad? Am I sharing too much? Whatever. So I think it is important to be authentic. And I like what you said earlier about how writing is like a way to kind of express yourself and um, kind of vent in a way. That's how I took it. And I think it's a great way to do that. And I think it's a great way for other people who are going through something similar to connect to that. Because I think reading is all about empathy. And I think reading teaches empathy. And if we're authentic, then it'll be easier for us to be empathetic if we hear the the truth in what somebody is saying versus like if they were gonna tell us like a polished version of that. I think it's more human and I think it's more relatable for us to read that. Um, and I also wanted to ask you, so this was published in 1929, and we're still talking about it now. Why do you think it's transcended time, and why do you think people like us and outside of us, like, why do you think people still talk about it?
Well, I think mainly because people change, even if it's for good or for bad. I think this book specifically, this essay, is not tailored towards one thing in particular, as we discussed earlier. It's a little bit more than just talking about women, about genders, about the poor and the rich. It can be applied to many different things, many different minorities, and it is something that we are going to be talking about for a lot of years to come. It's not something that we can just say, okay, that thing is sold, and we are not going to be touching that matter in the coming years. So I feel like it is impactful in the way that it is told. And I was thinking about the prompt that she was given when she was asked to talk about that, which is women in fiction. And I can say that yeah, she did address that, but she addressed a lot more than just women and just fiction in itself. So I feel like it's a genius way of talking about many things in one theme or one essay.
I agree with that, and I think that's what makes it so timeless, right? Like that's why we're still talking about it because it's not just about those. It's not just about those two things, and I think it also resonates a lot still. And I don't know that it ever won't resonate, right? Like I think even though there is progress and we are slowly trying to become more open minded, I think there's always going to be a space for this, right? Like there's always going to be a space for this topic. And she does talk a lot about like privilege in the sense of wealth, right? Like she talks about like I think I wrote it. Let me see about the quote here. Um, oh yes. So she says, "One cannot think well, love well, sleep well if one has not dined well." And for me, that really stood out because I think sometimes we don't realize the privilege of maybe not having to worry about money, or the privilege of not having to worry about, for example, right now, like I don't have to worry about my citizenship status, and that's something that I'm very aware of. And I think like I really like that she's hyper aware of these things, and I think like sometimes people put a lot of pressure um, on us to, oh well, why aren't you more engaged in this? Why don't you care about that? And why don't you do this? And it's like sometimes people are just trying to get by, like they're literally just trying to survive, right? And when you're in that state, you don't have time. I think in a lot of ways what Virginia Woolf is saying is that time is a privilege, right? And the only reason that her character in the book has that privilege is because her aunt died and and
Pretty
left
much.
her, yeah, like an inheritance, right? So like that's something that I think is really important that she brings up. um, Aside from all the other ways of disenfranchisement, I think social status has a plays a huge role, and it plays a role in, like, for example, the literature that we read, right? Because whoever wrote something, they had time. Whether they made it, either way, they still had some level of time for them to be able to sit down and write something. Versus, like, what about all those other stories that we don't know about because those people are literally just trying to survive, right? Like, those stories matter too, but unfortunately, we might not hear them and we might not know about them. So I think that's something that really stood out to me. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, or
Yeah, I was just thinking about what she wrote about, as you said, those stories that we don't get to hear about, that we don't get to read because they either didn't have the time, they didn't have the resources. When she goes into explaining about this invention of Shakespeare's sister, that maybe she had the same genius as Shakespeare, but she did not have the same opportunities because she had to marry young, or she just died tragically because of the circumstances, right? Um, Not to say that it would be the same nowadays, but there's other circumstances, as you said, that we can someone can worry about, as having a house, having to eat something to eat today, or anything like that. So it is interesting how we consider a work of fiction, a work of, even if it's nonfiction, someone has to have that time to write it, to get it out there, and sometimes that is not possible. Even if we all have the same 24 hours, does it doesn't mean that we have enough time to deal with those 24 hours of the day. So yeah, it is very interesting how she addresses that.
yes, and I really like that you bring up this thought experiment of Shakespeare's sister, right? Because when I read that, it reminded me of how, as a kid, I like when I grew up, there were certain things that were kind of like put my way, right? Like dolls and and all these other things. And me, I was not interested in any of that. I wanted to play with toy cars, and I wanted to play with remote control cars, and I wanted to ride my bike, and I wanted to do all these things that um, society and maybe culturally, like, they were not for me. And people were trying to tell me, like, these, you shouldn't do these things. And I think that's one of the ways that, you know, that's one of the ways that we set people up for success or failure. Especially when I think about, when I think about something like STEM, right? Like, those professions are typically geared towards boys and men, and they're still very male dominated. And I think about video games too, and how, like, again, boys, right? Like, I had a lot of cousins, and I have a lot of guy friends that they play video games. And when I was growing up, I tried to, but then there's other things that take up your time, like Virginia Woolf says, of, like, you know, as a girl, I was expected to maybe clean, and I had to do laundry and do the dishes and do these things. And so, like, if I'm doing all those other things, I can't really focus on my hobbies or these other things that maybe somebody else has more time for because of that, because of that. Um, so I think that's really interesting, and I'm glad that you brought that up about Shakespeare's sister. This idea of it. So I wanted to read a few other quotes and kind of get your idea of what you think. Um, so there's one here that I really liked, where she says, "Whatever may may be their use in civilized societies, mirrors are essential to all violent and heroic action. That is why Napoleon and Mussolini both insist so emphatically upon the inferiority of women, for if they were not inferior, they would cease to enlarge. So she's talking about how women are mirrors and they serve to kind of enlarge men. Um, Again, we're talking about it very binary, but what do you think about that quote?
Yeah, so that quote, thank you for explaining it, because at first when I read it, when I was reading the book, I could not get past the idea. Maybe because it's a bit more on the binary, um, and I was trying to think of the non-binary, like the separated idea of it. But now that you mention it, it is true to what we see as a society, because men tend to feel, well, in this way that she explains it, the men that she was reading about, they tended to um, feel self confidence or self fulfillment in putting others down, especially women, because many professors, many people were saying that women were inferior in a way. Um, but it is, I don't want to say just sad, but it is unfair that that idea has been put into society and it is still believed in some extent. But I know that we have been advancing and we have been aware that women are not inferior, just like men are not inferior or any other gender. But it is interesting that even she was aware of that at that time, and it still carries on to today.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think we still see that, right? And I think she's saying something interesting about the fact that people need to put others down in order to feel better about themselves, right? Like not just we can even think about bullies, or we can think about in terms of racism, in terms of sexism, in terms of homophobia, in terms of everything, right? Like there is this thing that exists where in order for somebody like inflate themselves and feel good about themselves that they have to make everybody else less than. And we do still see that, and it's unfortunate. Um, but yes, like you said, there are parts of progress, and we are moving towards hopefully away from this. But it's interesting that she was aware of that. I mean, I think her awareness is something that really stood out to me. Is how hyper aware she was, especially given her privilege. And so let me just read one more quote. She there's another part where she's talking about women and writing, and she says the world did not say to her as it said to them, "Write if you choose. It makes no difference to me." The world said with a guffaw, "Right? What's the good of writing?" Right? And it's this like message that women are being told at the time about like how what they have to say is not important. So what do you think of what she has to say about that?
So that one, I actually did like that quote as well. It is not just interesting, it's kind of funny to think of that quote as if the world were this place where it has favorites. So I had fun trying to think of the world as being like picking favorites and being like, oh, you're a woman, you, what do you have to say? I don't want to hear from you. When in fact is the same people, the same women even, trying to push that idea that no, we're not going to write because I've been told that I cannot do this. I've been told that this is not for me, that I am not capable of something, which keeps on with the idea of having prejudices, having these set ideas of what women and men are supposed to be doing. But yeah, it is funny to me to see that quote specifically in the sense of writing and relating it to genders in general.
Yeah, and also just like um, again, trying to expand on this, all the people, like, imagine if all the people that have been disenfranchised internalize this, which sometimes we do internalize it. But I mean, again, imagine all the stories that we wouldn't have and that wouldn't exist if people listened to this societal expectation of them, right? Like, your story's not important. That's not true. I think we all have something to say, right? Like, we all have something to add to the universe and to the literary world. So yeah, I really like that quote, and I'm glad that you also, like, it stood out to you. Um, and so I wanna ask you, what do you think is at the heart of this story? Like, what do you think is, like, one major takeaway that Virginia Woolf is trying to give people?
I feel like it's, well, one of the major takeaways here is focused on the minorities and what can be done about all the prejudice that has been surrounding them. Because at the end of the day, even if we have all of this progress, all of these changes, women are still a minority. Um, as you said, Black people, Mexican people, all kinds of nationalities that we can have in the world, they are still somehow a minority, and it is pretty noticeable that there are still some problems there. And for me to read this and still be able to relate to it, it says a lot about the times that she was uh, living in and thinking about all of this, because those ideas have are still standing even to this day, and it's been a lot of years since it was written. So I really think that's one of the main takeaways of the book.
That's yes, that's I yeah, that's a great takeaway. And just to add to that, I just want to say, yeah, like, I agree, and I think, um, yeah, like, I think one of the main points that goes off of what you said is that this lack of access to literature and to education. And I think, in terms of what you're saying, for me, what I got is there's also a lack of history, right? Like, when you try to erase somebody's history and who they are, then I think it just perpetuates these, like, biases and these isms, right? Like, which are not true, because we are all equally capable of doing the same things, and we are all equally worthy of doing the same things. So I think a lot of it has to do with, like, I think, knowing who we are, and having an understanding of, like, where these things originate, and how we've also been told something that's a lie, right? Like, which is what she talks about too. Like, women are being lied to. They're being told that they're not capable of doing these things, that they shouldn't write, that nobody cares about their writing. That's not true, right? Like, there's so many female or other authors that people are are interested in hearing those stories. Um, so yeah, so thank you for sharing that. And I also wanted to ask you, so we invited you to come and have this discussion, and I wanted to ask, what made you say yes?
Well, first of all, I love books. I love talking about books, and I saw this opportunity of talking about Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own, and I thought that it would be very interesting to see not just how my ideas form around the book, but how other ideas, your ideas, um, can influence the way that I think about it. But I'm happy that we have a pretty similar sense of what the book means. It's still different, but I like to see different perspectives on what I enjoy, and this book is one of the ones that I feel it's going to be sticking with me for a long time. So that's pretty much why.
Well, thank you for sharing, and I'm really happy to have you here, and I'm happy to have this conversation, because I think it's important to get different perspectives, and I think it's also important to, like I said, I'm looking at this from my perspective. But it's interesting to hear other people and what they have to say about it, right? And I think it really adds to. It's like we're continuing this whatever this like it's like a living thing. Like
Right.
we're carrying it on by having conversations and talking about it. And I also like for me this is certainly like something that really impacted me, and I think I'll be bringing it up probably annoyingly for a very long time.
Right.
So I'm really glad that we could talk about this. And again, I'm really happy that you agreed to come and have this discussion. And thank you for sharing all your thoughts too.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a really nice experience to share my ideas on this very special book.
Thank you. So thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.